Thanks for coming tonight. Usually, I'm accused anyway of taking the scenic route to explain things. At least that's what my wife often says. But given that I've got 40 minutes, I'm going to get very terse and concise and immediately cut to the chase of my thesis, which is that despite Vladimir Putin's considerable consolidation or personalization or centralization of power and decision-making at the Kremlin, probably at levels we haven't seen since the early 1950s, I think we are wrong to see him as the primary driver of the parlous state of relations between Russia and the West, and specifically between Russia and the United States. If you think about all the negative or nasty things we could say about Putin: brutal, murderous, dictatorial, expansionist. Without too much difficulty, we could say it about each of the three men that I've got up there, the ones I label Putin's Godfathers. It wouldn't be a stretch to apply the same labels to them. Or if we think about the issues that Putin finds himself dealing with. And for sake of time, we're only going to concentrate on one, which is Ukraine. Adjusted for time and space, these men, these Godfathers, other aggressive exponents of Russia's national interest, if you will, dealt with them pretty much in the same way. So rather than seeing Putin as a one-off, I think what we have to do is see him in a continuum. And here I'm being a little radical. Perhaps my conclusion is that to be an effective leader of Russia or of the Soviet Union, you have to possess these qualities in spades. And you have to deal with these issues and drive policies that are going to be almost definitionally antithetic to Western, U.S. interests and preferences. This is sort of, this dynamic, if you will, is 'twas ever thus, 'twill ever be. The Israelis used to have an expression about one-bullet regimes, meaning if you killed the leader, things would change. Russia is not a one-bullet regime. These issues are going to long survive us, long survive Putin. So who are these Godfathers? Joseph Stalin, dictator of the Soviet Union, and I think that's the right word, from the early 1920s to his death in 1953. This is a man who ripped the Soviet Union into the 20th century through this massive program of industrialization. And he had some signal successes in so doing in the late 20s and in the early 30s, at a time when the Western world was suffering the effects of the Great Depression. I think we have to give him credit for that. One reason he was so successful in ripping the Soviet Union into the 20th century is that this is a man who brooks no opposition. He assassinates political rivals. He executes upwards of 1.5 million people in the Great Purge of 1937-38. As many as 9 million citizens of the USSR, half of them from Ukraine, die during the drought and famine of the earlier 30s, the Holodomor, as it's called in Ukraine, one of the more unfortunate and less successful concomitants of his industrialization program. In the Second World War, and Stalin, possibly because of the Great Purges, where he kills most of his general staff, Stalin is very directly involved in the military strategy of the Soviet Union. In 1941, he is invaded by his erstwhile ally, Nazi Germany. After expending about 10 million Soviet lives by 1943, the Red Army is able to chase the Germans out of the Soviet Union, and then spends the next 2 years, 44 and 45, chasing the Germans, in fact, to the gates of Berlin and beyond, across Eastern Europe. Having done so, Stalin says, I think it's a good idea if we stay here. So the Red Army actually occupies Eastern Europe, or most of it, for the next 45 years. And what Stalin has done in so doing is established forward defenses 700 miles west of his country's borders. And this is a country that has been invaded 6 times in 250 years from the west. And he also establishes a group of faithful satellite states in Eastern Europe, which help support him in his claim that he, and more importantly, perhaps the Soviet Union, really does deserve a voice in global councils, that they are the equal of the United States, the other great victor of the Second World War. And this drive for equality is critical to understanding Stalin. It's critical to understanding why he developed the atomic bomb. He needed it, not simply for military purposes, if you will, but again, to buttress his claim to parity, to equality, to, I'm not going to call it legitimacy, with the United States as a global leader. He couldn't claim that without it, or he could try, but he certainly is well underwritten by it. Today, very credible polling in Russia has more than 50% of the people saying he is the country's greatest leader of all time. And this is because he established the Soviet Union, in their eyes, as a claimant to the same greatness of the United States. What's a little more troubling to me is that a bigger percentage, somewhere closer to 60%, say his brutal methods were justifiable. And so he dies in 1953. He is ultimately succeeded by one of his henchmen, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was not a killer on the scale of Stalin, although as one of his henchmen, he is certainly complicit in Stalin's excesses. And he's not above a little bloodshed as well. When Hungary, one of these satellite states, in 1956, first tries to do a little reforming and then ultimately threatens to break away from the Soviet Union, Khrushchev has no problem in allowing the Red Army to exact very, very bloody retribution. Thousands of people die. Khrushchev does preside over a period of technological parity and, in fact, even leadership over the United States. I'm thinking of the space race. Sputnik, first man in space. But the very, very idea, space race, this is a contest with the United States. He is trying to prove greatness vis-a-vis the United States. He's trying to, he creates and reinforces the perception of the Soviet Union as a force to be dealt with. He gets a little ahead of himself in trying, again, in this race, in this case the arms race with the United States, to install nuclear weapons in Cuba. Cuban Missile Crisis. Doesn't go well for Khrushchev. And in fact, begins a process by which he is deposed 2 years later. But what we ignore is at the same time as he's putting missiles in Cuba, he is also providing tremendous economic aid to that country. Aid which continues for another 30 years at very unfavorable terms to the Soviet Union. But this is an example of the Soviet commitment to the third world. Now, Nikita, I think, truly does believe in the forces of national liberation and anti-imperialism. But it's also where he competes with the United States. This is where he believes he shows he is the equal. Now, these two men are 20th century, people within, if you will, Putin's recent memory, our recent memory. But these dynamics, this aesthetic, if you will, goes back hundreds of years. Peter the Great, not nearly as murderous as even Khrushchev, let alone Stalin, although amongst his victims is his own son. Peter may be the first Russian ruler who makes the country a true European power. He defeats the greatest soldier of the age, who, believe it or not, is a Swede. Charles XII of Sweden is the great soldier of the late 17th and early 18th century. Peter, in the Great Northern War, which lasts a long time, manages to conquer a fair amount of territory from Sweden, which becomes northwestern Russia as we understand it today. Leningrad, St. Petersburg, is in fact on territory that was Swedish at one point. He gives Russia the ability to project itself into Western oceans 12 months a year through taking this territory on the Baltic. To this point, Russia is basically landlocked in terms of its maritime capacity. He is a modernizer, and like Stalin, if you will, he rips his country into the 18th century. He builds this new capital of St. Petersburg, named after himself, really, and imports thousands of Western engineers, technologists, architects, designers to help him build this city. But think about that. He is emulating Western technology. He is bringing Westerners in to do it. What's implicit there? We can't do this. There is this nagging realization that we are not equal. So how do you compensate? And it's not just Peter, but the Russians themselves. How do you compensate? If you can't do it materially, if you can't do it technologically, morally, philosophically, spiritually. And Peter is seen symbolically as the champion of Russian orthodoxy in the religious sense against Swedish Lutherans, Polish Catholics, Ottoman Turks. But he is also the emperor of the Third Rome, and this goes beyond religion into spirituality, a different form, if you will. The First Rome, which is conquered in 476 by the Vandals, the great seat of civilization. The Second Rome, Constantinople, captured by the Ottomans, 1453. Russia is the Third Rome, in the sense of that we are the moral leaders of, I'm not sure if we are West or we are East, but we are the moral leaders. This is a form of, if you will, psychological compensation from feeling discriminated or inferior, if you will, technologically. So all three of these men project power and national ambition, but they crave what I call effective, not formal, but effective legitimacy that comes through some form of parity, equality, if not superiority, vis-a-vis the West. And it's not just these men themselves. Their followers feel the same way. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I think the first thing we have to understand about him is that this man is an unreconstructed spy, secret policeman. This affects his perceptions, it affects his calculations, it affects his image. At the very least, this is a man who is hardwired for paranoia and suspicion. And we forget that at our peril. What we also need to understand is this is a man who, as a relatively minor apparatchik in the late 80s and early 90s, watch as the system in which he grew up, in which he was marinated, if you will, in which he was trained, and in which he is tasked to manage as a member of the KGB, falls apart very quickly and very steeply under Mikhail Gorbachev, and things get worse for Russia under Boris Yeltsin. He is determined to become the anti-Gorbachev, the anti-Yeltsin. Remember, this is a man who says the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, personally, I'd put my money on the Second World War, but okay. His view is a little nuanced here, and I think we do have to give him some credit. One of the things that happens is Russia goes into a period of economic and social collapse, which, amongst other things, affects it as a platform for projecting equality with the United States. Something else that dissolves is Ruski Mir, Russia world. This is, if you will, a modern riff on this notion of the Third Rome. And what also occurs, and he thinks this is one of the great tragedies, is the dissolution of the USSR, which is 15 countries in theory, leaves 25 million Russians or Russian speakers outside the border of Russia. A lot has been written by a lot of people about Putin. The best book I have ever written, the best book I have ever read is Putin's World by a woman named Angela Stent Miller. She codifies the world according to Putin, what I call his 7 pillars of wisdom. And I'm just going to give you a few of them. Russia has a right to sit at the table of global councils. Its interests are as legitimate as are the West's, specifically the United States. Very specifically, Russia has a privileged position in what we'll call the post-Soviet space. In other words, it is really up to Russia to dictate the velocities and trajectories of all the former Soviet states. To wit, they cannot join alliances that Moscow sees as hostile. Only great states are entitled to absolute sovereignty. Everybody else in his neighborhood has to respect Russia's right to sort of oversee things. And the rules-based international order is something that the Soviet Union had very little to do with, that Russia had absolutely nothing to do with, so we can discard it. We don't like this. His biggest adversary, the biggest thorn in his side or burr under his saddle, is the West, the United States. And objectively, this is a man who has no reason to trust the United States. There's some questions about what was promised to Mikhail Gorbachev about NATO expansion in return for, if you will, the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. It can be debated as to whether it was promised it would never happen or that the promise was at best fuzzy. But expansion has happened. Economic reform in Russia in the 1990s, which was pretty disastrous, is seen by many, including a man who is paranoid like Putin, as in fact a Western plot to weaken Russia. In the Balkans, Russian interests in the Yugoslav wars were completely discarded. First in the Serbian fight against Bosnia, and later the Serbian fight against Kosovo. They were just ignored. Yeltsin tried to make his point. He thought he had been promised that his points would be attended. They were completely ignored. Jump 2011, regime change or not in Libya. The US manages to get the Russians to abstain in the Security Council about action in Libya with the promise that they are not going after Gaddafi. They are not trying to change the leadership there. Well, what happened? No more Gaddafi. So I think Putin has a right to say, well, the West has lied to me. I think Putin sees himself and is seen by many Russians as an avatar of traditional Russian authoritarianism. And this goes back to the Tsars. It was later taken over by the Bolsheviks. And of Russian exceptionalism, this third realm, Ruski Mir. And again, this goes back to the time of the Tsars. It is not Soviet in origin. And this authoritarianism, this exceptionalism, have at best a love-hate impact and relationship with the West. And Putin needs to be seen as equal by the US. Nothing so stuck in his craw as when Barack Obama called Russia a regional power. This isn't just words. These are weapons, and I think they have to be understood as such. So, quick look at this map, and these are my little remarks here. From the early 1700s until 1941, Russia is invaded 6 times from the West, including Poland in 1920. Did you know that? Poland invaded the Soviet Union. Charles XII, Napoleon, Crimean War, charge of the Light Brigade, didn't go so well for the Light Brigade. World War I, Central Powers, Poland, 1920, Nazi Germany. Almost all of these invasions, by the way, at least have a number of operations in Ukraine. And keep that in mind. So, how does Ukraine figure in perceptions of Soviet or Russian national interests? We'll start with Russia. We'll start with Peter. Peter is Tsar from approximately 1690s, co-Tsar for a while, until the 1720s. During this time, Ukraine, as such, has very fuzzy borders. Part of it is Russian, part of it is Polish, part of it is Cossack, with what is known as the hetmanate, because the leader of the Cossacks is called the hetman. And the biggest enemy, if you will, for generations of the Cossacks have actually been the Poles. So starting in the mid-17th century, Russian czars begin to make common cause with the Cossacks, who are, after all, Orthodox, against the Catholic Poles, to help keep the Poles at bay. And Peter is no exception. But the hetman, around the turn of the 18th century, a man named Stefan Mazeppa, begins to worry that Peter's promises of assistance and aid may come at quite a cost. He suspects, and probably rightly, that Peter wants to limit the autonomy of the Cossacks. And so what Mazeppa does is he actually breaks with Peter and allies with Charles XII when the latter invades Russia. Big mistake for Mazeppa. Because when Peter defeats, well, the signal battle of the Great Northern War, which lasts 20-odd years, 1709, the Battle of Poltava, deep in modern-day Ukraine, by the way. This may be day one of Russia being a great power. And from that point on, the nominal, but more importantly, the effective autonomy of the Cossacks is pared back and pared back and pared back. So it may have been a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's jump 200-odd years. Stalin wielded a very heavy red pen in the 1937 publication of a book called The Short History of the USSR. He probably wrote the chapter on Ukraine, in which he says that for thousands of years, or 1,000 years anyway, Russians and Ukrainians have been united. Now he pitches it as an exercise in state building, as an exercise in national defense. He's trying to get the Ukrainians to understand that their histories, and more importantly, their futures, are tied together. Now, this has to be seen, this is 1937 publication, this has to be seen against the backdrop of the famine and drought that occurred throughout the Soviet Union, but particularly in Ukraine in the earlier part of the 1930s. As many as 5 million Ukrainians died in what were either very misguided agricultural collectivization programs, or, and there are a number of historians who debate this, deliberate policies on Stalin's part to weaken the Ukrainians. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. So Stalin is not necessarily held in good odor by the Ukrainians. When he's followed by Khrushchev, Khrushchev games Ukraine. He does have some genuinely strong positive feelings about Ukraine. He grows up very close to the Ukrainian border. I believe his wife was Ukrainian. In 1954, one of his first acts as he consolidates power is to gift to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic the Crimean Peninsula that until that point was legally or geographically or cartographically part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. A gift. Now, Nikita was a crafty little bastard. many scholars feel, and I think there's a fair amount of plausibility here, that what he does is by gifting a peninsula of 20 million people, most of whom are Russian or Russian speakers, he's actually diluting the Ukrainianness of Ukraine. And I think this is a far more plausible explanation for what he does. So these three, who are not given to either generosity or certainly generosity towards the West, have very, very strong ideas about how Ukraine is important to them. But even Boris Yeltsin, who arguably, or at least faute de mieux, is the most pro-Western Russian leader in 300 or 400 years, even Yeltsin believes that Ukraine is basically at heart part of Russia's patrimony. He sees Crimea and the Donbass, which are very topical places these days, as Russian territory, despite official post-dissolution negotiations and agreements that they are part of Ukraine. And it's not just him. His parliament, the Duma, in May of 1992, declares Khrushchev's 1954 transfer illegal. Perhaps more importantly is that the post-Soviet Union arrangement of the post-Soviet states was called the Commonwealth of Independent States. Nominally, they're all equal. But Yeltsin always thought that Russia was, at a minimum, primus inter pares, first amongst equals, and that really by virtue of its size, its heritage, its whatever, it really deserved to be attended, and that this was just a formal organization, and that the effective one is that Russia was still going to lead. And this is Yeltsin, our friend. So, what does Putin think? Why does he invade? Well, if you think about that map for a minute, Ukraine has been the gateway, not always the main gateway, but a gateway to invasion of Russia or the Soviet Union for 200 odd years. He does not want to see NATO stationed across the, or just on the other side of the 1,400-mile border that Russia and Ukraine share. The threat, the geopolitical threat to Russia is, to most people's minds, it's Western. Now, we could argue that. Some people who are either paranoid or farsighted might say, no, the real threat to Russia today is actually from China, but that's another evening's discussion. But for Putin to effect a global shift from the rules-based international order to the old-fashioned balance of power and spheres of influence, he has to have Ukraine as part of his bailiwick, or otherwise it is both strategically and conceptually impossible. An independent Ukraine may be a greater threat spiritually, if you will, than geopolitically. An independent Ukraine is antithetic to a revived Ruski Mir, Russia world. It questions the leadership of Russia and presents alternative models of governance and rights that could not work in a Russia-led sphere of influence. So then you ask the question, is his opposition to these Western Ur values sincere or simply expeditious in trying to use this spiritual argument of the Russia world, the Third Rome, to argue his point, rather than naked geopolitics, saying, no, this is important on a much higher plane. If Stalin writes that book in 1937 or edits the book in 1937, Putin actually comes out in July of 2021, 7 months before his invasion, where he writes that, he says that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians they're common heirs of the Kievan Rus going back almost 1,000 years. And their separation was a Bolshevik error, and now the West is encouraging it. In a very chilling line, the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. But 13, 14, some odd years before that, in a conversation he had with George W. Bush, he said, you know, George, Ukraine is not even a country. So this was his thinking a lot longer ago than 2022 or 2014. This is a statement on record in 2008, and he's been probably thinking about it a lot longer than that. So here's a question. If there can't be a Russian empire, however you want to phrase it, without Ukraine, can there be a Russia without Ukraine? Go with me here. Unless Putin has his way and wins, and I don't just mean, if you will, talking a win, but actually feeling that he's won. If he doesn't, will he and many Russians simply add this episode to the list of, and it's a long and growing one, of Russia's historic grievances? If parity, legitimacy, equality is an inseparable part of Russia's idea of what its national interest is, then it is likely, far more than likely, to survive Putin. And would survive even in the very unlikely event of a reforming pro-Western leader, which ain't going to happen anyway. Well, I'll quickly end by talking about some people in the West who've actually had success of a sort in dealing with the Russians. The Russians fight a war with Turkey, 1877, 1878, and do very, very, very well. And essentially the terms of settlement is that they get most of the Balkans in one form or another. The British, the Austrians, and the Germans are very, very worried about this as upsetting to the balance of power. Bismarck goes to the Russians and he says, you know, the British and the Austrians are very, very upset about this. I'm the honest broker here. I really think you should pare back your winnings, because otherwise you're asking for a lot of trouble. And at the Congress of Berlin, they actually do. The Russians actually very reluctantly, very angrily walk away from many of their gains. The ultimate settlement is far short of their military victory. Russia capitulates. It feels humiliated and betrayed, not least because Bismarck himself has just unified Germany through a series of wars. So they think that this is the height of hypocrisy. The greatest professional diplomat the U.S. has ever produced is a man named George Kennan. I hope you agree with me on this, Fred. Kennan writes perhaps the most famous diplomatic dispatch of all time. And it's called the Long Telegram. And you could discuss the Long Telegram. There would be another evening session, and I'm not pitching. The important points of the Long Telegram, which underwrite his policy of containment, containing the Soviet Union. Several things. With the Soviets, you have to see classical geopolitics, Russian national interests, transcendent Russian national interests, but it cannot be seen as the legacy of the czars, because otherwise, what's the difference between us and the czars? So you have to have an ideological wrapper. He says what you must understand about the Soviets is that they're not sure if they are East or West, if they admire the West or they envy it. The Western military deterrent is needed only until the Soviet system collapses of its own weight. For him, containment, the Marshall Plan, this is all about contracting U.S. military commitments and aspirations, not extending them, and that the decisive kinds of things that the West has already accomplished is making sure Japan and Western Germany are part of our orbit. This is the true triumph of the Second World War and what he hoped would not eventuate into a full Cold War. He's actually, and he's claimed as the ultimate realist, but capital L liberals in international relations thinking claim him as one of their own as well. Henry Kissinger. Kissinger's policy of détente in the late 60s and early 70s is drawn from a point that he made in his doctoral thesis, which is that all major players in the international system, victors as well as vanquished, have to have an investment in the stability of the system, and that for Kissinger, the Soviet need for acknowledged parity, legitimacy, is a tool by which he can get them on board in his bigger plan of triangular diplomacy, being closer to Beijing and to Moscow than they are to each other, and what he called the structural improvement of the relationship of these countries in such a way as that the balancing of their self-interest will promote global peace and the security of the United States. Bismarck's plans work for maybe 10, 12 years. Kennan's, it's tough to say, but containment, which really was never executed the way he intended, some aspects of it probably lasted 20, 25. Kissinger's Soviet détente, maybe 10 years. These are the smartest guys in the room. These men, I think, can be claimed as geniuses. I know my slip is showing here, we haven't got any geniuses today at Foggy Bottom or in the White House trying to figure out how to deal with the Russians. So I'm not sure that anybody is really smart enough to do what in essence these three men were able to do for a short period of time. Keep the Russians off balance, but sufficiently satisfied or sufficiently not unsatisfied, maybe a better way of putting it, to try to upset the apple cart too much. going to end with a quote from another U.S. diplomat, Charles Bolin, who's one of, again, the wise men in the immediate post-World War II period, and one of the great Soviet experts of the U.S. State Department, one of the great Russia hands, who said, I know that if any man utters one of these two phrases, he's either a liar or a fool. The first one is, whiskey doesn't affect my judgment. And the other is, I know how to deal with the Russians. So, I'm a little trepidatious here, folks. I haven't got any solutions. I don't see any on offer that strike me as very, very promising. But, or more importantly, and, these are problems that are here to stay. As I say, they are going to long survive any of the players and all of us. So with that, let me take any questions. Thank you. I think you had your hand up?
Yes. Are you saying that Russia's intents have to do with national security and parity and equality with the West, and not empire and the reassembly of the motherland, the expansion of the motherland?
I think these are both important to them, but I think that the form it takes, which is the reassembly, is less important than the sense of acknowledgement. I think the sense of acknowledgement is something that is redolent throughout the national history and the personal history of all of these leaders.
Rick, what do you make of the argument that Putin is running a kleptocracy? That he's stealing from the Russian people, and that what he fears more than anything else is an independent Ukraine tied to the European Union, prosperous, democratic, and really, from his point of view, a bad example for Russians.
Well, two things. That he is a kleptocrat is, I think, beyond any doubt. Do I think his people care? No. I think that, as with those who forgive Stalin all of his sins, I think his very successful keeping Russia apparently and possibly effectively close to equality with the United States, the West generally, but really is all about the US, is so important to his followers that they will forgive him. The example of Ukraine as everything Russia isn't, and everything others could be. I don't think that the geopolitics are as important as what I'm going to call this. You could call it the political model. You could call it the spiritual one. In other words, that which is the essence of Russia is incompatible with a viable, not even a vibrant, but a viable Ukraine, able to stand independently, even if its institutions are flawed. I don't think Ukraine has to be the exact opposite of everything Russia is for it to be sufficiently different to damage both the imperium, in other words, that which Russia rules, but also it also provides a very bad example for what Russia could be as well.
Could you give us some examples of how that plays out within Ukraine? That conflict between the democratization, which is dangerous to Putin, and the workings of their relationship?
It's been a long time since I've been in Ukraine. It is not a model democracy. Literally today, discussions about new investigations of people very close to Zelensky, who is a hero to us. I found myself saying, what if he was to be found to be personally corrupt? Would it change things? Would it change things for me? I'd have to say no. I don't think that Ukraine is anywhere near a model of Western standards in anything. Not in press freedom, not in, well, right now there aren't too many political parties that have been outlawed, but that's not impossible. There are oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs, not simply Ukrainian oligarchs who are very friendly to Russia. There are the corruption of Ukrainian society is pretty rife, even today. This is not a struggle for Ukraine's soul, this is a struggle for Ukraine's survival, which I think are two different things. Does that answer your question?
Not entirely.
I'm like I say, it's been so long since I've really focused on what's going on in Ukraine that I'd be hard put to give you a definitive answer of how things are playing out there.
Right. I guess you're saying on the one hand, there's a desire on the part of Russia to incorporate Ukraine, right?
In one form or another.
But partly because of what it has that is positive, not just the grain, the breadbasket, but something about its history and its political realities.
I think that what is more important than what Ukraine could physically contribute is, going back to the present, that it cannot be seen, it cannot be allowed to be seen as the non-Russia. It cannot exist, it cannot survive and not affect Russia's ability to project power externally, but also to maintain it internally.
Oh, really? And could that same argument be made about Central Asia?
Central Asia, the stands.
Yeah.
If Ukraine were successfully incorporated, however we want to define that, into Russia, then I don't think the stands matter. If Ukraine falls, then we have the opposite of the domino effect. The others will pull away further.
What about, do you think that Russia would stop at Ukraine? I have two questions. What about the Baltics?
I do think that Putin won't stop until he is stopped.
So, one of the things you said struck me as a little naive, I may say. So, when you spoke of all the Russians in those countries, you're aware that there was this huge population exchange, that Russia exiled many Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians, and Czechoslovakians, and imported and placed Russian.
Lots. Oh yeah. No. That was quite a deliberate Russification of the other republics. So sometimes it was punishment. Sometimes it was quite deliberate. After all, remember, Stalin was Commissar of Nationalities. He understood the dynamics very, very well. So this started under,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
long ago.
No, so I think that the protection of Russian speakers in the near abroad is both sincere on the part of Putin and many Russians, and it's incredibly opportune. It is a really good excuse. When in doubt, say we're protecting the Russian speakers.
My other question is, what do you think would have happened at Yalta if Roosevelt had been in better shape?
Nothing. What were Roosevelt and Churchill going to do? How were they going to stop? I think both men, yeah, FDR, the fantasy is that he kept thinking he could control Uncle Joe. And that Churchill was far more realistic. Churchill himself had essentially conceded the Balkans, not officially, but effectively conceded the Balkans to Stalin.
But half of Germany, well,
2-minute riff here.
Oh.
If Churchill's idea for establishing the Second Front, do you know where he wanted to invade? The northern Adriatic. Send the Allied troops up what's known as the Ljubljana Gap, due north. So what do? You cut the Russians off in Poland, and if not even further east than that. Once the decision was made to go to France, I think everybody knew that they didn't want it to happen, but I think they knew there was a damn good chance Stalin was going to occupy Eastern Europe. So even if FDR had been at the top of his game, by the decision to go to France, the game was already played out.
So would you agree that, A, we are always at war, economic war, not military, but we're always economic war. Your map of the invasions of Ukraine, of Russia, all came through Ukraine. And isn't that because, as the breadbasket, that's what Russia really needs?
Oh, they need it.
And that their people are happy as long as they can eat. And if they can't eat, and don't have that grain, then there's trouble at home.
The old, we used to call it guns or butter. Yeah. No, I think the breadbasket of Ukraine is useful to Russia, but I do think the spiritual element of not allowing the outlier to continue is more important. But to say that we will always be at war with Russia, depending on how you define war, yeah.
Well, we're at war with one another within our space, but economic. But there's always been the thought of Russia, and you mentioned it, Russia being landlocked and therefore on the defensive. So therefore, your point about Latvia, Estonia, and so forth, it's logical that he will want that, but he also would want Ukraine for the ability to get out to the Black Sea and therefore into the Mediterranean.
Although, like I say, however, remember, controlled by Turkey. I mean, geographically, legally, even though there are freedom of navigation treaties, whether or not you want to believe it, Turkey is a NATO ally. They could close it off here. You could close off the Baltic. I think I'm not a naval strategist. I would think it's a little more difficult. And now, especially with global warming, Murmansk, probably not as icebound as it used to be. So, like I say, with technology and climate change, I'm less compelled by the geopolitical argument and more compelled by what I'm perhaps inaccurately calling the spiritual one. Peter?
If we project the possibility that the West gets its act together, the United States joins Western Europe again, and the Russians are militarily defeated, and an independent Ukraine is established. When you look at your crystal ball, does that mean the complete shattering of Russia and the stands as a weak Russia, and then the stands moving to become more independent, and then the Chinese moving west? I mean, what happens if we win?
Yeah.
Well, let's assume for the moment that we don't have a war, a classical war, but we still have a conflict that the West wins, a la the way Kissinger won it, a la the way Kennan, a la the way Bismarck won it. I suspect that that's going to lead to a great deal of, as if it already hasn't, Russian revanchism. So it will only make relations worse. Now, does it matter if it's a weaker Russia that hates the United States more? I don't know. If it is a military conflict, I think we're in serious trouble. We are talking about the world's two largest nuclear powers. We are talking about Putin as saying he would use them. If it became a true military struggle, not enough of a strategist, but I don't see an alternative to escalation to nuclear weapons. Maybe not ICBMs, maybe theater nuclear weapons, but once that's out, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So if it comes to blows, I think all bets are off. I think it's got the best possible world is against a diplomatic victory for the West that isn't sufficient, that doesn't make the Russians sufficiently unsatisfied.
I think that needs to be the last comment for the reason that I should say, and we have to thank you for an amazing talk, but the biggest complaint we have had from people who come to these talks is they go away very depressed. I would say after the one about cyber crime, for example, people said they couldn't sleep for 48 hours. And I think what I would like to end with is the possibility of something working out that isn't just terrible. The destruction of Ukraine or the destruction of the world with a nuclear war. So,
then you know what? Pray for a Kissinger. If that's not one of the most heretical things I've ever said. Well, we have Fred Hoff.
Ambassador Hoff.
Yes. It needs, as I said, real creative diplomacy that I just don't see anybody at this point capable of devising. I hope and pray that somebody will come along who can figure it out. But I'm looking across the piece and I'm not hearing anything that I find compelling.
well, thank you.